It was a cold London evening, the kind of night when the city lights looked softer through the mist and the sound of carriage wheels mixed with the quiet hum of modern traffic. Captain Edward Langford, one of the most trusted royal guards of Buckingham Palace, was finishing his shift when his phone buzzed. He usually ignored calls when he was on duty, but this one came from a number that had once belonged to a palace employee, a jeweler who had served the late Queen for many years. The message was short but urgent. "Captain Langford, you need to see this. They're selling Her Majesty's jewels tonight in Mayfair." Edward's eyes narrowed. The jewels of the late Queen were sacred, part of royal history, part of Britain's heart. They were never to be sold, borrowed, or taken outside official records. If this was true, then something serious was happening. Without hesitation, he left the palace grounds after signing out, still wearing his formal dark coat and his medal of service. The streets of London glowed in gold and silver lights as he made his way through the quiet alleys of Mayfair. When he reached the old brick estate mentioned in the message, the grand doors were open just enough for him to see a small crowd inside. It wasn't an ordinary auction. There were no cameras, no public announcements, only soft music, murmurs, and men in black suits guarding the doors. A crystal chandelier hung above a polished marble floor, and guests sipped champagne while admiring items displayed in glass cases. Edward blended into the background, keeping his hat low. His years of training had taught him to stay calm and quiet, even when his instincts screamed for action. He moved closer, careful not to draw attention, until his eyes caught sight of something that froze him in place. There, under the warm golden light, stood Lady Camilla Fairborn. She was elegant, tall, and carried herself with royal grace. She had once been one of the late Queen's favorite relatives, a woman often seen beside her during charity events and royal tours. But tonight she wasn't dressed like a royal figure. Her gown was expensive but daring, her eyes sharp as she spoke quietly to a foreign buyer wearing a silver pin on his lapel. Edward's heartbeat quickened. On the velvet tray before her rested the Queen's heart, a sapphire brooch surrounded by tiny diamonds shaped like the royal crest. The Queen had worn it during her final address to the nation, a piece that symbolized loyalty, duty, and unbroken faith. Every guard at the palace knew its story. It was priceless not because of its gems, but because of what it represented. Edward's hand tightened around his glove. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Why would Lady Camilla, of all people, be doing this? He moved to another corner, pretending to look at a painting as he watched her show other jewelry to the same buyer. There was the pearl necklace the Queen had worn during her visit to India, the diamond earrings from her coronation, and even a small tiara that had belonged to the royal collection for over a century. Each piece carried history, moments of kindness, leadership, and love that defined the Queen's long reign. Edward's thoughts were heavy. He had stood guard outside the Queen's door many times, had seen her wave to the people with calm dignity. The idea that her most personal treasures were being sold like ordinary goods broke something inside him. He felt both anger and deep sadness. When the auction ended, Lady Camilla handed the buyer a small envelope. Edward noted the exchange and quietly slipped outside, making sure not to be seen. His heart was still pounding, but he knew what he had to do. The Crown's trust was everything to him. He couldn't allow this to continue. That night he returned to the palace long after midnight. The corridors were quiet, the grand portraits watching silently as he made his way to the royal archives. He had permission to enter after hours in special cases, and tonight, this was one of them. He needed to check the official inventory of the Queen's personal collection, what had been passed down, what had been stored, and what was missing. The room smelled of old paper and polished wood. He opened the royal ledger and began comparing each piece listed to what he had seen at the auction. His chest grew tight as he confirmed one after another: the sapphire brooch, the pearls, the tiara. They were all recorded as secured. None of them were marked for removal. According to the records, they were still supposed to be inside the vault beneath the palace, but someone had signed a request to move them a month after the Queen's passing. The signature was almost perfect. Same slant, same loops, same royal formatting. Almost perfect. But Edward had worked too long protecting the royal family to miss small details. The ink was different, slightly faded compared to the usual ink used for official signings. The date didn't match the usual approval process either. His instincts told him it was a forgery. He copied the page and locked the ledger again. Every step he took echoed in the marble hall. He didn't want to believe Lady Camilla could do such a thing. She had always spoken of loyalty, often sharing stories about the Queen's kindness. She had been like family. But the facts didn't lie. Edward drove home in silence that night. He sat by his window watching the rain slide down the glass. He thought about the Queen's funeral, about how the world had mourned her. The flowers, the tears, the prayers, it had all been about respect. And now, just months later, someone had dared to betray that respect for profit. He remembered her words during one of her last public speeches. The measure of one's honor is not in what they gain, but in what they protect. Edward felt those words burning in his heart. He couldn't let this matter be buried quietly, but he also knew he had to move carefully. One wrong move could bring scandal to the crown. The royal family valued discretion above all else. The next day he met with the palace treasurer in private. The older man was loyal and discreet, and when Edward showed him the copy of the ledger, his face turned pale. "Good heavens," he whispered. "If this gets out, the press will destroy her, and the monarchy's image." Edward didn't answer. He was thinking of the Queen's portrait in the hall, the one she had posed for during her Golden Jubilee. She had trusted everyone who served her. That trust was now broken. By evening, Edward had gathered enough proof to start a quiet internal review. He ordered the vault rechecked and the surveillance logs retrieved. The royal jeweler confirmed that the items were indeed missing and that no removal request had ever been filed under proper protocol. Edward barely slept that night. He kept thinking of the way Camilla had smiled at that auction, confident, almost proud. It wasn't just about money, something deeper was driving her. Maybe greed, maybe entitlement. But whatever it was wrong. Before dawn, Edward returned to the palace courtyard. The morning air was cold, and the first rays of sunlight touched the golden tips of the palace gates. He stood there silently, feeling the weight of duty on his shoulders. The royal family still slept inside, unaware that one of their own had broken the sacred chain of trust. For Edward Langford, there was no greater duty than protecting the legacy of the crown. He knew that soon he would have to confront Lady Camilla face to face, and that moment would change both of their lives, forever. As he looked up at the fluttering royal flag above the palace, he whispered quietly to himself, "For Her Majesty, and for the truth." The city was waking up, but Edward's mission had just begun. The following morning, London seemed unusually bright, but for Captain Edward Langford, the light felt heavy. He hadn't slept properly since the night he saw Lady Camilla at the secret auction. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her hand lifting the sapphire brooch, the one every guard knew by heart. He could still hear her calm, charming voice as she spoke to the buyer, pretending nothing was wrong. At the palace, life went on as normal. The changing of the guards drew tourists, the staff prepared for royal meetings, and the new monarch's assistants moved through the halls in quiet rhythm. But Edward felt something different now, like there was a shadow behind all the polished gold. He decided to act quietly. His first step was to confirm what his eyes had seen. In his years of service, Edward had learned one rule above all: never accuse without proof. So he reached out to a trusted friend, Margaret Holden, the head archivist who managed the royal collections. She was elderly but sharp, with a memory as precise as the royal clock. When Edward entered her small office lined with books and velvet folders, she looked up from her paperwork. "Captain Langford," she said softly, "you're here earlier than usual." "I need your help," he replied. He explained what he had seen: Lady Camilla, the auction, the Queen's heart brooch. Margaret's face grew serious. She stood up slowly and opened the large inventory book she kept locked in her desk. Together they went through the list of the late Queen's personal jewels. One by one, Margaret read the names: sapphire brooch, pearl necklace, coronation earrings. She stopped. Her thin finger traced the line on the page. "All listed as secured, Captain. None marked for removal." Edward took a slow breath. "Could someone have forged the authorization?" Margaret frowned. "Only two people have that level of access, myself and Lady Camilla. She was granted special permission by Her Majesty years ago to oversee certain charity displays. But after the Queen's passing, all permissions should have been frozen." That was all Edward needed to hear. He requested a copy of the authorization forms and examined them under the light. The handwriting was neat, almost perfect, but the ink tone and pen style were different from Margaret's usual signature set. Edward knew that Camilla's secretary had occasionally signed smaller papers on her behalf. It was a small but dangerous window of opportunity. Margaret looked at him worriedly. "Captain Langford, if this is true, we must inform the Crown immediately." He nodded, but his tone was calm. "Not yet. I need to be sure. If this becomes public too soon, it could damage the royal image forever. Let me trace it quietly." That evening, Edward walked through the palace corridors in silence. His polished shoes echoed softly against the marble floors. Every painting on the wall seemed to watch him: kings, queens, soldiers, reminders of what loyalty truly meant. He made his way to the palace's internal security department, where all comings and goings were recorded. There he found exactly what he feared. 3 removal requests from the Queen's private vault dated weeks after her death, all signed under Lady Camilla's clearance code. The items listed matched the ones he had seen at the auction. Edward leaned back in his chair. The paper trembled slightly in his hands. There was no doubt now Camilla had taken them. He didn't want to believe it, but there it was in black and white. He decided to confront her directly, but first he needed one last confirmation. He called his contact at the private auction house in Mayfair. The man was reluctant at first, but when Edward quietly mentioned national property, the tone changed. Within an hour, Edward had proof: a list of items that had been offered for sale under the name C. Fairborn. The sapphire brooch, the pearl necklace, and the tiara were all on that list. Edward felt a wave of sadness more than anger. He had served long enough to know that greed often hid behind fine manners and polite smiles. But he had hoped better from Lady Camilla. She had once given a speech about honor and sacrifice at the Queen's Jubilee. Now that very word, honor, had vanished from her actions. Later that night, Edward sat alone in his small flat overlooking the Thames. The city lights shimmered on the water, but his mind was restless. He thought about the Queen, the way she used to greet him by name, the kindness she had shown her staff. She had once said, "Service is measured not by applause, but by what you do when no one sees." Edward had repeated that line to younger guards countless times, and tonight, it became his guide. The next morning, he received a call from an old friend who worked at a foreign embassy. The man confirmed that a rare sapphire brooch of British design had been offered for private purchase by an intermediary claiming royal ownership. That was the final proof Edward needed. Contacted the Royal Treasury and explained the situation in strict confidence. The Treasury officials were shocked, but they trusted Edward's integrity completely. "You're certain of this?" one asked. "Beyond any doubt," Edward replied. A quiet investigation was authorized under palace supervision. Edward handed over the documents, photographs, and his written statement. Still, he knew the next step would be the hardest, facing Lady Camilla herself. That afternoon, as the palace prepared for a charity luncheon, Edward stood by one of the grand staircases, watching as Lady Camilla entered in her elegant cream suit. Her hair was perfectly styled, her expression calm and proud. The same woman who once stood beside the Queen now smiled for the cameras, greeting guests as though nothing was wrong. Edward's eyes followed her movements. He felt no hatred, only disappointment. After the luncheon ended and the guests departed, Edward received a short message on his secure line. "Permission granted. Approach quietly. Do not alert the press." He knew what that meant. Tomorrow morning he would confront her, with truth, not accusation. That night he walked alone through the palace garden. The air was cool, filled with the scent of roses the Queen had loved. He remembered the day of her funeral, the soft rain, the silence, the guards standing still as the bells tolled. He remembered promising himself that her legacy would remain untouched. Now that promise was being tested. He thought about what Camilla might say when he confronted her. Perhaps she would deny everything. Perhaps she would cry or blame someone else. But Edward didn't care for excuses. The jewels were not just stones and metal. They were symbols of faith, leadership, and service. Selling them for money was like selling the nation's memory. He returned to his quarters, polished his uniform, and placed his white gloves neatly on the table. In the mirror, his reflection looked tired but determined. His eyes carried the weight of quiet duty. Tomorrow, at dawn, he would stand before Lady Camilla, not as a man seeking justice for himself, but as a royal guard protecting the heart of the crown. For Edward Langford, this wasn't just an investigation anymore. It was personal. He had sworn to protect the Queen's honor even after her passing. And that oath, he knew, had no expiration. As the clock struck midnight, the palace lights dimmed and the soft hum of the city faded. Edward looked out at the palace one last time before resting. Somewhere deep inside, he felt the late Queen's words again, calm and steady, as if echoing in his memory. Do what is right, even when no one thanks you for it. And Edward knew exactly what he must do when the sun rose. The next morning came quietly over London. The palace was still half asleep, and a thin fog wrapped around its tall gates like a curtain. Captain Edward Langford stood near the courtyard, his uniform pressed sharply, his gloves spotless. He had not slept, but his mind was clear. Today he would face Lady Camilla Fairborn. The Queen's personal car collection gleamed faintly under the morning sun. Birds fluttered near the fountain, unaware that something serious was about to unfold within these royal walls. Edward checked his watch. 6:15 a.m. He knew Camilla would arrive soon. She always came early to attend her private breakfast meetings with royal advisors. Edward's heart was steady, though a heavy sadness pressed against it. He respected the royal family too deeply to enjoy what he had to do. He didn't want to humiliate her, but truth was truth, and duty was duty. Just then, a black car approached quietly from the palace gate. It was long, polished, and unmistakably Camilla's. Edward straightened as the car stopped near the entrance. Her chauffeur stepped out and opened the door. Lady Camilla emerged, dressed elegantly in a gray coat, pearls shining at her neck and a soft smile that looked confident, almost too confident. She didn't notice Edward at first. She took a deep breath of the crisp air and started walking toward the palace entrance. That's when Edward stepped forward. Lady Camilla, he said respectfully but firmly. She turned, a bit surprised, though her expression remained polite. Captain Langford, she said in her usual composed tone. You're up early. Is there an event today? No, my lady, Edward replied. There's something we need to discuss, something of importance to the crown. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. At this hour? She asked with a small laugh. Surely it can wait. I'm afraid it cannot. Something in his voice made her pause. There was no anger, but there was authority, the kind that came from truth. She glanced at her chauffeur, who stepped back quietly, sensing tension in the air. Edward took out a small folder he had kept inside his coat. These are copies of the authorization papers to remove the Queen's personal jewels from the royal vault, he said. They bear your name. Camilla's eyes flickered for the briefest moment, but she recovered quickly. Yes, she replied smoothly. Her Majesty gave me those permissions herself years ago. I've always overseen her collection for charity displays. Edward nodded. That is correct, my lady. You had permission, but only during Her Majesty's lifetime. These documents are dated weeks after her passing. They were signed when she was no longer with us. For the first time, her confident tone faltered. That's impossible, she said, frowning. There must be a misunderstanding. Edward remained calm. The palace archivist verified the dates. The ink, the handwriting, even the approval stamps, all show clear signs of forgery. And the items removed under your name were found at a private auction house in Mayfair. Camilla blinked, her breath catching. An auction house? She repeated, forcing a small laugh. Captain, do you hear yourself? Why would I ever? Edward interrupted gently but firmly. I saw you there, my lady. Her words stopped. I was in that room, Edward continued. I saw you show the Queen's heart brooch to a foreign buyer. I saw the pearls, the tiara, every piece that went missing. Camilla's face went pale. For a moment she stood frozen, her lips pressed tightly together. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of a distant bell tower. Finally, she looked at him sharply. Do you have any idea what you're saying? Do you realize what an accusation like this means? Edward met her gaze without fear. I do. That is why I came to you first, privately. I did not inform the press. I did not call for public guards. I wanted to give you the chance to explain before this reaches the crown. Her eyes narrowed. So that's it? You play hero and I become the villain? Edward didn't respond. He wasn't here to argue. He was here to protect. Camilla turned away, walking a few steps toward the palace gate. Her heels clicked sharply on the stone floor. "You think you know everything," she said quietly, "but you don't. You have no idea what kind of pressure this family is under." Edward spoke softly. "Pressure doesn't justify betrayal." Her shoulders stiffened. For a moment she didn't turn back. Then slowly she said, "You don't understand what it means to be forgotten, Captain. When the Queen passed, my name was erased from the invitations, the meetings, the trust funds. I gave my life to her service, and when she was gone I was treated like a stranger." Edward listened quietly. Her voice trembled now, not from guilt alone, but from years of bitterness. "I was desperate," she said. "I thought I could use the jewels to fund the charities she loved. No one believed in me anymore. Not even the new advisors." Edward stepped closer, lowering his voice. "If that's true, my lady, you could have asked for help. The crown always listens to loyalty. But selling what belonged to Her Majesty's heart, that is something no one can excuse." Her eyes filled with unshed tears, but she hid them quickly. "You've already judged me," she whispered. "No," Edward said softly. "I'm just doing what she would have wanted, protecting what she trusted us with." For a long moment, neither spoke. The early sun broke through the fog, casting golden light on the courtyard. It illuminated the royal crest on Edward's chest and the pearls at Camilla's throat. A strange, symbolic sight. Then footsteps echoed behind them. The royal treasurer and 2 security officials approached quietly. Camilla stiffened as they arrived. Edward stepped aside respectfully, his task now complete. The treasurer spoke in a calm, formal tone. "Lady Camilla Fairborn, by order of the Crown, you are requested to surrender all royal possessions in your care until a full inquiry is completed." Camilla's lips parted, her face pale as marble. "So it's come to this," she whispered. "I'm afraid so, my lady," the treasurer replied. Edward stood silently, watching as she removed the pearl necklace from her neck. Her fingers trembled as she handed it over. "These were given to me by the Queen herself," she said softly. "She said they suited me." Edward wanted to say something kind, but duty held his tongue. The treasurer nodded to Edward, signaling him to escort her to her residence for the rest of the collection. As they walked, she kept her head high, though her steps were slower now. At her townhouse near the palace gardens, Edward oversaw the recovery of several jewel cases hidden in a safe. Each was marked with the royal seal. Camilla watched in silence as the officials catalogued them one by one. When it was done, she turned to Edward. "You've done your duty well, Captain. The Queen would be proud of you." Edward looked at her with quiet sadness. "I only wish she could have been proud of us all." She gave a small nod, her eyes distant. "So do I," she whispered. By the time the officials left, the sun was fully up. Edward stood outside, breathing the cool morning air. The sound of church bells drifted across the city once more, soft but solemn. He thought of the late Queen, her kindness, her patience, her sense of justice. As he looked up at the sky, he felt that maybe, somewhere above those clouds, she was watching. He straightened his shoulders and walked back toward the palace. The day had just begun, but his heart carried the weight of what had happened. The truth was out, but it came at a price, one that hurt everyone involved. Still, Edward knew he had done the right thing. Loyalty sometimes meant standing against those you once respected. It wasn't about anger. It was about protecting the honor that others had forgotten. And as the palace gates closed behind him, Edward Langford reminded himself quietly, "A guard's duty never ends, not even when the Queen is gone." The following day, the entire palace felt different. The calm rhythm of the royal schedule carried on, but underneath the polished walls and quiet halls, whispers flowed like hidden rivers. Everyone had heard something, though no one dared speak it aloud. The late Queen's jewels had been stolen, and the name being spoken behind closed doors was one that once inspired respect: Lady Camilla Fairborn. Captain Edward Langford moved through the palace corridors with steady steps. His face was calm, but his eyes showed exhaustion. The day before had been long and heavy. The jewels were recovered safely, the documents handed to the royal treasury, and Lady Camilla confined to her townhouse under supervision. Now, a royal inquiry had been called. It was not to be made public, not yet. The king wished to handle the matter quietly, out of respect for the late Queen. Only a few senior officials, legal advisors, and witnesses would be present. and Edward, who had uncovered the truth, had been called to testify. By noon, the hearing chamber was ready. It was one of the older rooms, with dark wood panels, velvet curtains, and portraits of the royal lineage hanging on every wall. The air smelled faintly of candle wax and old books. A long table stood at the center, and at the head of it sat the king himself, composed, serious, and silent. His expression revealed no anger, but a deep sadness. When Lady Camilla entered, escorted by 2 attendants, everyone rose out of respect. She still looked graceful, her posture straight, her face carefully calm, but her eyes no longer carried pride. They were tired, perhaps even broken. She bowed slightly before the king and took her seat. The chamber doors closed. No journalists, no cameras, just truth and silence, the royal legal advisor began. We are gathered to address the matter of crown property, the jewels belonging to Her late Majesty, which were unlawfully removed and nearly sold in secret. Evidence has been presented that points toward Lady Camilla Fairborn. We will hear testimonies before His Majesty gives final judgment. Edward was called first. He stepped forward, bowed respectfully, and began to speak in his calm, precise voice. I served the late Queen for 21 years, he said quietly. On the night of June 10th, I received information regarding a private auction in Mayfair. I attended in secret and witnessed Lady Camilla offering items that matched the descriptions of Her Majesty's personal jewels. He described what he saw, the sapphire brooch, the pearls, the tiara, and how each piece was later verified as authentic. He presented copies of the authorization forms that had been forged and explained the inconsistencies in the dates and signatures. Throughout his testimony, Camilla sat still, her hands clasped tightly on the table. The king listened silently, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. When Edward finished, the legal advisor thanked him and dismissed him to the side of the room. The next to speak was Margaret Holden, the palace archivist. Her gentle, trembling voice confirmed what Edward had said. The removal of the jewels was not recorded in official documents, and the authorization was indeed forged. Then, it was Camilla's turn. She stood slowly, took a deep breath, and spoke with quiet dignity. Your Majesty, she began, I will not deny that the jewels were in my possession, but I did not intend to betray the crown. After the Queen's passing, many of her charities lost funding. I believed I could raise money discreetly to continue her work. Her voice cracked slightly as she went on. I had no intention of keeping the profits. I meant to return the pieces after securing the funds. But I see now that what I did was foolish and wrong. I let desperation blind my judgment. The king listened, his expression unreadable. Lady Camilla, he said finally, the Queen trusted you deeply. She saw in you a woman of grace and loyalty. Why did you not come to us? Why act in secret? Camilla looked down. Because I felt forgotten, Your Majesty, she whispered. When the new court was formed, my name disappeared from every list, every duty. I thought this was the only way to continue serving her memory. There was a long silence. Edward, standing nearby, could almost feel the weight of the words hanging in the air. He saw a tear glimmer briefly in Camilla's eye before she turned her face away. The legal advisor spoke again. Regardless of motive, the act remains unlawful. Crown property cannot be taken or sold without express permission from the sovereign. The evidence leaves no room for doubt. The king leaned back in his chair. His eyes went to the portrait of his late mother, the Queen, hanging above the chamber doors. She was smiling gently in the painting, the same way she always had when speaking of forgiveness and faith. Finally, the king spoke, his tone calm but firm. Lady Camilla Fairborn, your years of service to the royal family are known and appreciated, but your actions have deeply dishonored the memory of the Queen. Trust once broken cannot be restored by intention alone. He paused, letting the silence fill the room again. Therefore, by my authority as sovereign, you are hereby stripped of your royal privileges, titles, and positions within the royal household. You will no longer represent the crown in any capacity. Camilla's lips trembled slightly, though she tried to remain composed. Yes, Your Majesty, she said softly. I understand. The king nodded once. However, he continued, because you surrendered the items willingly and cooperated with the investigation, you will not face public disgrace. The matter will remain private for the sake of the late Queen's legacy. Camilla's eyes filled with tears. Thank you, Your Majesty, she whispered. As she turned to leave, she stopped briefly near Edward. For a moment, the two simply looked at each other. There was no anger in her expression now, only acceptance. "You did what you had to do," she said quietly. "I suppose in another life I might have done the same." Edward bowed slightly. "For Her Majesty," he said softly. When the chamber doors closed behind her, the room felt suddenly colder. The officials gathered their papers, and the king dismissed them one by one. But before Edward could leave, the king called out to him, "Captain Langford." Edward turned and bowed. "Your Majesty." The king studied him for a moment. "My mother trusted you," he said, "and today you have proven that her trust was well placed. The jewels are safe because you chose honor over comfort. You have done this family and this country a great service." Edward bowed again, humbled. "I only did what was right, Your Majesty." The king gave a faint smile. "That is why you wear that uniform. Never forget, and loyalty is not a word. It is a choice made every day." Edward left the chamber quietly. Outside, the afternoon light poured through the tall windows, warm and golden. He walked down the long corridor where the Queen's portraits hung. Her familiar smile seemed to follow him as he passed. For the first time in weeks, his chest felt lighter. Justice had been served and dignity preserved. The jewels would soon be returned to the royal vault, and the story would remain hidden from the world, known only to those who had lived it. As Edward stepped outside into the palace courtyard, he looked up at the clear blue sky. The flag above Buckingham Palace fluttered softly in the wind. It was a new reign, but the values the Queen had lived by, loyalty, truth, and quiet courage, still guided those who served her. He took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and walked on. Somewhere deep inside, he hoped that the late Queen was watching, not with disappointment but with pride. A week after the royal inquiry, life at Buckingham Palace slowly returned to its usual calm. The grand halls once again echoed with the sound of footsteps, and the guards stood tall at their posts as tourists admired the royal gates from outside. Yet for Captain Edward Langford, things did not feel quite the same. Something within him had changed, not in duty but in spirit. For days, he had been unable to forget the image of Lady Camilla standing in the chamber, stripped of her title, bowing before the king with quiet dignity. There had been no public scandal, no media storm, only silence, the kind the palace always preferred. But even silence could carry a heavy weight. Edward spent most of his hours supervising the return of the late Queen's jewels to the royal treasury. He moved carefully, ensuring every piece was accounted for and restored to its rightful place. Each item came with a memory. The Queen's heart brooch, the sapphire surrounded by diamonds, glowed softly under the vault's lights. The pearl necklace still carried the faint fragrance of the lavender oil the Queen had once favored. The tiara, delicate and shining, reminded him of her last public event, where she smiled warmly at the cheering crowd. As Edward placed each piece back into its velvet-lined case, a deep respect filled his heart. These were not just ornaments. They were symbols of history, reminders of sacrifice, love, and service. They had seen joy, loss, and unity, and they now rested safely again, thanks to a promise kept. When the last jewel was sealed in its box, Edward locked the case gently and turned the heavy key in the vault door. The sound of the lock clicking echoed softly through the quiet chamber. He stood there for a moment in stillness, lowering his head slightly, a silent salute to the woman who had trusted him, and to the truth that had guided him. The next morning, Edward was summoned to a private meeting. It was held not in the formal halls, but in a small study overlooking the palace gardens. The king wished to see him. When Edward entered, the king was seated by the window, dressed in a simple navy suit. The afternoon light streamed across the room, giving everything a calm golden tone. He motioned for Edward to sit. "Captain Langford," the king said kindly, "it has been a difficult few weeks for everyone, especially you. You carried a heavy burden, and you did it with grace." Edward bowed his head respectfully. "It was my duty, Your Majesty." The king gave a faint smile. "Yes, but it takes more than duty to do what you did. It takes courage to stand for truth when silence would have been easier." He paused for a moment, looking out at the garden where the Queen's favorite roses bloomed. "My mother trusted you deeply. You honored that trust, not for reward, but because it was right." Edward didn't speak. He didn't know what to say. The king continued, "The crown owes you a great debt, Captain. You will be commended in the official records, but more importantly, I want you to know that your actions have reminded us all of what service truly means." He stood and extended his hand. Edward rose and shook it firmly. "Thank you, Your Majesty," he said quietly. "I only wish the Queen were here to see that her legacy is safe." "She is," the king said softly. "In her own way she is." When Edward left the room, he felt an unfamiliar peace. For the first time in many days, the palace no longer felt heavy. It felt alive again, as though the spirit of the late Queen had returned to its halls proud and grateful. Outside, the autumn wind was gentle. The leaves in the royal gardens danced in the breeze. Edward walked along the cobblestone path near the fountain, his steps slow and thoughtful. He watched the sky, a clear shade of blue that mirrored the color of the Queen's heart sapphire. It almost felt like she was watching from above, calm and smiling as always. Later that week, Edward visited the palace chapel. He often went there when his heart felt full, sometimes with pride, sometimes with sorrow. The small stained glass windows filled the room with soft colors. In the quiet, he knelt before the altar, saying a silent prayer. He didn't pray for himself, but for the Queen, for Lady Camilla, and for the royal family. He prayed that truth would always have a place in their hearts, no matter how heavy the crown might feel. As he rose to leave, the chapel door opened. Margaret Holden, the elderly archivist, entered slowly with her cane. She smiled warmly when she saw Edward. "I heard you were here," she said gently. "You've done more for this palace than most people will ever know." Edward smiled faintly. "I only did what anyone loyal would have done." Margaret shook her head. "No, Captain." Many would have looked away. "You didn't." She handed him a small envelope sealed with the royal crest. "The king asked me to give this to you." Edward opened it carefully. Inside was a simple letter written in fine ink. "To Captain Edward Langford, for upholding the honor of the crown and protecting the memory of her late majesty, you are hereby appointed keeper of the royal collection." Below it was the king's signature. Bold and clear, Edward blinked, quietly moved. It was not a title of power, but of trust, the highest kind of recognition a servant could receive. It meant he would now oversee the Queen's historical possessions personally, guarding them for generations to come. He looked at Margaret, speechless. She smiled. "It seems the palace still knows how to thank those who serve it well." That night, Edward returned to his quarters and placed the letter neatly in his desk drawer. He didn't boast about it. He didn't tell anyone. He simply felt grateful, not for the honor, but for the peace that came with it. In the following days, Lady Camilla quietly left London. No public announcement was made. Some said she went to live in a small countryside estate that once belonged to her family. Others whispered she had devoted herself to the same charities she had once tried to fund through the jewels. Whatever the truth, Edward hoped she found some form of redemption. He bore her no hatred.
He understood that even those who fall sometimes do so out of sorrow, not malice. On the last evening of that month, Edward stood once more at his post by the palace gates.
The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink as the sun began to set. The sound of distant traffic mixed with the soft rustle of flags in the wind. He stood tall, his uniform shining faintly under the golden light. Tourists watched from afar, taking pictures, unaware of the quiet story that had unfolded within those royal walls. As the final bell of the evening rang from the palace tower, Edward turned slightly toward the windows of the royal residence. Inside one of them hung a portrait of the late Queen, her gentle smile eternal, her eyes full of grace. He raised his hand slowly in a final salute. Not the sharp salute of ceremony, but a small, heartfelt one, a gesture meant only for her. In that silent moment, he felt her presence, as though she were whispering, "Well done, my guard. You kept the faith." A soft smile touched his lips. The wind brushed past, carrying the faint scent of roses from the garden, her favorite. As the sun disappeared beyond the London skyline, Captain Edward Langford stood unwavering, guarding not just a palace, but a promise of loyalty, honor, and truth that would outlive them all. And though history might never record his name in books, the spirit of one faithful guard would remain forever in the heart of the crown he had sworn to protect.